Well, welcome everybody to Christmas at Cedar Creek. Now, for those of you who may be new or you're spending your first Christmas with us here at Cedar Creek, you may have noticed that one of the big parts of our holiday celebration as a church is our Christmas water offering. In fact, for the last 10 years during the Christmas season, we've encouraged you to consider donating over and above your regular gifts to be able to give the gift of clean water to people all over the world. And over this past decade, your response, your generosity has been phenomenal. In fact, you've already given over $500,000 to clean water. And in fact, in just the last 4 years, you've given nearly half of that, $240,000. And that means that just since 2018, as a result of your generosity, we've been able to drill 15 clean water wells and provide 4 water filtration systems on 3 different continents, providing daily access to clean water for over 15,000 people. Yeah, that's worth celebrating. Think about what that means. That means this morning, 15,000 people woke up not having to worry about where their water supply would come from. Women and young girls would not have to make miles-long trips, walking, carrying heavy containers of water. Thousands of parents woke up today not having to worry about whether or not their children were going to get sick and potentially die from waterborne diseases. But listen, this is not just about writing a check or clicking a donate button to give to a good cause because it's Christmas. This is about connecting your generosity with God's faithfulness, because that's where lives are truly transformed. In fact, it's through your generosity to the water offering, we've actually been able to reach out to, connect, and serve people who live in some of the most difficult and hardest to reach places on the planet. And one of those, believe it or not, is the country of Pakistan. And so I've asked our good friend and global peace partner, Bishop Mushtaq, to share with you just a little bit this morning of how your generosity is changing lives in his community. So check it out.
Hello, Cedar Creek Church, Pastor Phillip and the leadership team. I am so thankful for your kindness and incredible generosity. Because of you, we were able to reach more than 4,000 people in 3 cities of Pakistan, Tharparkar, Kotri, and Karachi. In Kotri city, we have built a water well and put 2 small water filters for the Hindu background believers. And at Tharparkar, which is a desert of Pakistan, there was no water there. We have put an entire big solar system for the entire village to get water from this existing well. Before, what they were doing, they were using donkeys, camels, and women and children were pulling water to get a bucket. And it was very difficult for them, but now the entire village and the neighbor village people have the access to water on a daily basis. In Karachi city, which is the metropolitan city, Christian lives in slums. There is no water on those slums. We have installed a new water well in one of those slums and provided assistance to repair the existing 2 water wells. We have also installed 2 solar systems for the existing water system that we had, including one system that exists in a school for the children and the community of that Christian slum. So thank you very much for your generosity. Again, for your partnership, for your love. We have a great opportunity to share the love of Christ to our neighbors and the Christian community in Pakistan. May the Lord bless you. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Jesus. And thank you, Cedar Creek Church. And I would just encourage you to be praying about how God might want you to be a part of transforming lives all over the world. Now, if you'll grab your message notes, you'll see we are continuing in this series that we're calling Home for Christmas. And the goal, the big idea behind this series is to help us recognize that while Christmas is ultimately a celebration of God making His home among us, sometimes we forget that that means that we can be home or have a home with God. Like whoever you are, wherever you've been, whatever you've done or not done, however far you think you've drifted away from God, Christmas means that you can have a home with Him. We discover this great truth in our theme verse for this series from Psalm chapter 90, verse 1. It says, Lord, through all generations, you have been our home. And you know, as I shared with you last week, these words were written by Moses. Yes, that same Moses who spent 40 years leading the homeless nation of Israel wandering around in the desert. They could not go back to their homes in Egypt, and they couldn't yet make their home in the promised land. But Moses says, even though we don't have a physical home right now, God, our home is with you. Listen, your home is not some nostalgia from the past where you grew up. Your home is not something you just have to wait for until you die to experience. Your home is right here, right now with God, because home is not a physical location. Home is about being in the presence of God. And that's what Christmas is all about. And so each week we've been unwrapping a different gift that is waiting for us when we come home to God. Last week we talked about the gift of hope, right? That hope was not just some wishful thinking or warm, fuzzy feeling we get during the month of December. That hope was built on the reality of God's power and God's promises available in our lives. Now today I want to look at another great gift that's waiting for us when we come home to God, and that is joy. I mean, joy and Christmas go together like Sonny and Cher, right? Which is to mean you can't think of one without thinking of the other. But in reality, it was a very rocky relationship. And we talk about Christmas as being the season of joy. The word joy appears in over 70% of our Christmas songs. It's written on over 50% of our Christmas cards. And yet for many of us, joy seems elusive. It is hard to find. And for all of us, it can be even harder to hold on to once we find it. And yet the Bible tells us that joy is not just something we can have at Christmas, but joy is something we should have all the time. In fact, notice the second shortest book in all of the Bible, 1 Thessalonians 5:16. Paul says, always be joyful. Now, as a communicator for over 20 years, one of the things I've learned is to not use words like always and never, or everybody and nobody. Why? Because they're almost never true. There's almost always exceptions, right? And yet Paul not only says always, but he says it in the form of a command. If you look at the grammatic structure in the Greek, the language that Paul wrote in, he's not saying always be joyful is a suggestion. He's not saying it's a goal or a good idea you should strive for. He said it is a command of God. Think about that. Think about the implications for that. That when I lose my job, I'm to be joyful. When the test results come back from the doctor and they're not good, I'm to be joyful. When I stand over the grave of someone I love, I'm supposed to be joyful. I mean, is that even possible? The answer is yes, if you understand what joy really is. Because see, most of us confuse joy and happiness, and they're two very different things. Happiness is a positive emotion I feel based on my circumstances. I feel good because of what is happening to me. But joy is not an emotion I feel. Joy is a choice I can make, no matter what my circumstances are. In fact, that's why on your outline, I'm defining joy as this: the confidence that comes from choosing to trust God more than my circumstances. Let me say that again. Joy is the confidence that comes from choosing to trust God more than my circumstances. See, joy is this deep, settled confidence that comes from knowing that God is in control of the details of my life. Christmas means I can make that choice. And there's probably no better example of someone who chooses joy than the shepherds of Bethlehem that first Christmas. You'll find their story in the 2nd chapter of Luke's gospel, beginning with verse 8, but you probably don't have to look it up. You probably already know their part in the Christmas story, right? Either you grew up in church hearing it read, or you watched Charlie Brown's Christmas special, and you know Lionel goes up on stage and he reads the story, he tells us the story, right? And there were shepherds in that same country abiding in the fields, keeping watch over their flock by night. And lo, an angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were sore afraid. I love that phrase, sore afraid. I have no idea what it means. I've never heard it used anywhere else. I guess it means you're so scared, your muscles tighten up, and you're sore the next day. I don't know what it means. I just love the phrase. The problem is, we are so familiar with this story that sometimes it seems more like a fairy tale than a reality. Like this story should start with once upon a time, but it's not a made-up story. The birth of Jesus was a very real event that took place in the lives of very real people, and that includes the shepherds of Bethlehem. When you think about those guys, what do you think about? Like if you close your eyes and tried to picture the shepherds of Bethlehem, what do you see? You know what I see? A group of middle-aged men wearing bathrobes, fake beards, carrying a stick with a hook on it, and Nike tennis shoes, right? One too many bad church Christmas pageants. I'm not down on church Christmas pageants. I'm just saying that sometimes they cause us to think of the story of Jesus' birth as like a cartoon or a fairy tale. But that view of shepherds actually changed for me about 18 years ago. I was traveling on a global peace trip to Romania. We were there to teach home group leader training to the Romanian pastors in the capital city of Bucharest. And on one of our days, we had a day off, and so our hosts, the global peace workers that lived there, they took us from Bucharest, the capital city, to this long journey to visit this little village in the mountains up near Germany called Chennai. What I remember is the drive took forever, and there was nothing anywhere around. We drove for hours. Once we left the city, it was pretty much just a straight, simple 2-lane road with nothing but fields as far as the eye could see. It was like driving in Montana on steroids. It just went on and on and on. Nothingness. And then all of a sudden, I'm looking out the window and I see out in the field in the distance kind of this blob. And I'm like, what in the world is that? And our host said, oh, that's a group of shepherds watching their sheep. And I'm like, slow the car down. I've got to see this. I got to take pictures of this. And sure enough, it's about 150, 200 sheep. And there were 3 guys just out in the field with those sheep. And you know what? They weren't wearing bathrobes. They didn't have fake beards. They didn't even have the sticks with the hook on it. They were just 3 blue-collar guys doing a job that was very difficult, very dirty, and very isolating from others. And that same thing is true for these very real shepherds of Bethlehem. And so as we unpack their story, I think they show to us 3 choices that can help us choose joy. 3 ways we can choose joy no matter what's going on in our lives. So let's jump in. Number 1, the first thing I have to do to choose joy is choose to hear the good news. Choose to hear the good news, which is no easy task in this world we live in today, is it? We are surrounded, bombarded, immersed in bad news. Turn on the TV, right? Scroll through your Facebook. Listen, if it bleeds, it leads. If it's bad news, it gets top billing, right? Look at Facebook. What are the posts that get the most interactions in them? The positive stories? No. The negative, argumentative stories. And we want to blame this internet age that we live in, and we want to blame the media. But do you know why those things are what they show? Because it's what we're drawn to. It's what we want to watch. It's part of our human nature. We're drawn to that, to the negative, to the dark, right? This is not a new 21st century phenomenon. Jesus dealt with this with his audience 2,000 years ago. That's why often Jesus, when he was teaching a crowd or even talking to a group of people, he would often make a statement and then say, "He who has ears to hear, let him hear." Why? Because you can hear it and not hear it, right? If we're not intentional about trying to hear and focus on the good news, it's easy to miss in the white noise of negativity around us. Same thing was true for the shepherds. Notice verse 10. It says, "But the angel said to them, 'Do not be afraid. I bring you good news that will cause great joy for all the people.'" Now I want you to circle the phrase good news, and I want you to circle the phrase great joy. What's the difference between good news and good news that causes great joy? It's when it is personal, right? If one of you were to this week win the Mega Millions lottery jackpot, that's good news. Great joy would be if I won the jackpot. You see the difference, right? Good news causes great joy when it happens to you. Now, put yourself in the shepherd's sandals. How easy would it have been for them to hear this message from the angel that Messiah has come to them, and for them to think, well, that's great for religious people. Oh, that's great news for the uptown folks, but what difference does it make for me, an outcast, an outlaw, and a shepherd who nobody thinks anything about? But see, they made the choice to hear all the news that the angel had shared. Not just the good news that Messiah was born, but the good news that he had come for all people. And that included outlaw shepherds like them. So let me ask you a question. What are you listening to? What is it you're choosing to hear? Are you just listening to the temporary circumstances of your life right now? Or are you listening to the unchanging truth of God's promises to you? Love this verse from Hebrews chapter 10. It's talking to a group of Christians who had been struggling. It says, "You even had joy when all you owned was taken from you." How? Because you knew you had something better and more lasting. Look, I don't know what you have or what you don't have going on in your life this year. But I do know this. Christmas offers you something much better and much more lasting than your temporary circumstances. But you got to choose to hear that news. Doesn't stop there, though. There's a second choice you have to make, and that is you have to choose to do what God says. It's not just hearing the good news. It's not just believing the good news. It's acting on that good news. It's living in light of that good news. And that's what the shepherds do. Notice verse 15. It says, "When the angels had left them and gone into heaven, the shepherds said to one another, 'Let's go to Bethlehem and see this thing that has happened, which the Lord has told us about.'" Do you notice? They didn't say, "Let's go to Bethlehem and see if this thing has happened." They said, let's go to Bethlehem and see this thing that has happened. See, they don't hear this good news and just meditate on it in the pasture. They don't throw just a little shepherd's party in the fields. They respond, they act based on that good news. And in doing so, they discovered one of life's greatest truths, that joy comes from obedience. Now, I know that sounds counterintuitive, right? We don't think about joy coming from having to be obedient, right? Like if I say 10 commandments, I'm pretty sure the first thing pops into your mind is not joy, right? You usually think rules, regulations, hard to follow, get in trouble if I don't follow them. But I want you to notice what the Bible says. Psalm 19, verse 8. It says, the commandments of the Lord are right, bringing joy to the heart. The commands of the Lord are clear, giving insight for living. Listen, recognize these words were written by David, King David, a man who had lived following the commands, but he'd also spent part of his life in disobedience, outside of the boundaries of God's provision. And having lived in both of those worlds and experienced the consequences of both of that, looking back over his life, he would say, joy's in obedience. Why? Because God's our creator. He knows us. He knows what we truly need. He knows what will really fulfill us. And so he's given us these clear boundaries, these guardrails for our life. But those guardrails are not to keep us from good stuff. Those boundaries are to keep us for better stuff. Now that's all well and good when life is going well, right? It's easy to stay in bounds when life makes sense, but it gets tough when life doesn't make sense, right? It's hard to stay in bounds. My first reaction when life doesn't go the way I think it should is to think, well, God's forgotten about me. He doesn't hear my prayers, or he doesn't care, and so I got to take care of myself. And I immediately look outside of the boundaries. I've got to fix this problem. I got to meet my own needs. I got to medicate this pain because I don't want to feel it anymore. And it may feel good in the moment. It always feels good outside the guardrails for a moment, but in reality, we are trading real, lasting joy for happiness that doesn't last all that long. Think about these shepherds, right? Not one thing the angel said to them made any sense to them. I mean, not just the fact that they were the first people to hear the news, right? That God comes into the world and he's going to tell shepherds, but the fact that God came into the world as a baby. The God of the universe as a baby. And then the angel says, and by the way, that baby's not in the temple in Jerusalem or not in Herod's palace. That baby is in an animal stall. None of it made sense to them. And yet they trusted God more than their own understanding. And in doing so, they found joy. You know, if I'm honest, if I look at my life, so much of the problems and pain in my life are the result of my own bad choices, where I've tried to do for myself instead of waiting for God to do more than I could. I've gone outside of the bounds, and it has cost me greatly in a lot of ways. Now, I'm not saying all the pain is caused by my bad choices. Some's caused by the bad choices of others. Some by the fact that we just live in this broken world. But there's a lot of pain I bring on myself. And I imagine that's probably true for many of us here today. But listen, the message of Christmas is not a message of guilt and shame because you've been outside of the bounds. The message of Christmas is an invitation to come back home, to come home to God's love, his forgiveness, come back home to his plan and purpose for your good and for his glory. But to do that, you got to hear the good news. You got to do what God says. And then there's a third choice. You have to choose to show and tell others. You have to show and tell others. You notice I didn't just say tell others about the good news. I said you got to show it by the way you live. Do you know one of the reasons that many non-believers struggle to believe what we believe is because often as Christians, our mood doesn't match our mouth. Oh, we say we follow Jesus and we have the fruit of the Spirit. We're people of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness. We say all that, but we walk around looking like we've been baptized in vinegar and weaned on a dill pickle. We go through life like somebody licked the red off of our candy and tinkled on our cornflakes. We're all pouty and mad and in a bad mood. That wasn't the case with the shepherds. After they discovered that God's promises to them were real and true, notice what they do. Verse 17 says, the shepherds told everyone what had happened and what the angel had said to them about this child. And then look at what they do. They went back to their flocks, glorifying and praising God for all they had heard and seen. See, they didn't just tell people about the joy. They went back to their job, to their work, filled with that joy, showing that joy, living. Listen, nothing changed in their circumstances. You understand, these guys, these shepherds, they didn't become local hometown heroes in Bethlehem because they saw the baby. No, they were still outcast, ostracized. They were not allowed to go to the temple and worship. They were still considered to be liars and cheats, and you couldn't trust them. None of that changed in their circumstances. But everything changed in the way they saw themselves and the way they saw their circumstances. And it changes the lives of people around you. Have you ever noticed that? How contagious joy can be when you're around people who are full of joy. I'm not talking about happiness. I'm not talking about the perky little people who are always in a good mood that get on your nerves. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about people who live every day and every circumstance with a deep settled confidence that God is in control of the details of their life. When you're around people like that, it brings you peace. It brings you joy. It brings you hope. And the cool thing about joy is, not only is it contagious, but just like these clean water wells we were talking about, joy is the gift that keeps on giving. So what I love about joy is it's not a zero-sum game. Joy is not a limited commodity item, right? Sharing your joy with others doesn't diminish your joy. It actually increases it. And there's no greater joy than being used by God to help someone find their way back to Him. And there's no better way to do that, church, than by living in the joy that He has given us. So I want to close with this question for you. What is your Christmas message to the people around you? I'm not talking about what you're going to write on the cards. I'm not talking about you're insisting on a Merry Christmas greeting when you leave the store. I'm talking about what is the message of your attitude and your outlook to the people around you. What's your Christmas message to the checkout girl at Walmart? What's your Christmas message going to be to the server who's working in an understaffed restaurant and your food is late and then it's cold when it gets there? What's your Christmas message? What's your Christmas message going to be to that neighbor across the street who's just hard to get along with? Or what's your Christmas message going to be to your Facebook friends? What are your posts going to be about this Christmas? You have a lot of choices in how you can respond to the people and circumstances around you. You can respond with anger. You can respond in fear or frustration. But you can also choose to respond in joy. The choice is up to us. Would you pray with me? Jesus, I thank you so much for this reminder that what we're celebrating is not a fairy tale. It's not some little cartoon pageant. It is a hard, cold, true, real event that changed the lives of very real people just like us. And so, God, that is my prayer. This Christmas, beyond the decorations, the lights, the presents, the music, Santa Claus, in the midst of all of that, Jesus, we would recognize that Christmas means that we can trust in your promises. No matter what we're feeling in the moment, no matter what we're going through right now in our lives, that we can trust your promises. Maybe you're here today or you're watching online and you're struggling to find joy. And you've been running out of bounds looking to fix it, to medicate it, to feel or to not feel something different. And those decisions have destroyed relationships and destroyed things in your life. If that's you today, Christmas is not a time for guilt and shame. Christmas is just an invitation to come home. Come home to God's grace. Come home to His forgiveness. And more than all of that, come home to His plan and His purpose for your life. Well, Jesus, that's what this season is all about. Help us to live as if we truly believe that. It's in your name we pray. Amen.